Welcome to News Edge, your sharpest source for daily headlines and deep dives. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and stay ahead of the curve. The world held its breath. Every corner of the globe seemed to pause, united by a single question: could peace finally be within reach? On a crisp September day, as the first rays of sunlight touched the snowy peaks of Alaska, history was quietly being written. U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin met in Alaska, a symbolic location chosen for its history and its distance from the battlefields of Ukraine. Once Russian territory, Alaska now stood as the stage for a potential turning point in the Ukraine war, a place where old rivalries and new hopes collided. This was no ordinary summit. Security was tight, the atmosphere electric with anticipation, and the stakes higher than ever before. The stakes, ending a brutal 4-year conflict that had shaken the world. The lead-up was tense, with every headline and rumor dissected by a nervous public. European leaders, especially from the EU, UK, and Canada, demanded Ukraine's voice be central, not sidelined. They insisted that any peace must be forged with Ukraine, not simply imposed upon it. Their message was clear and unwavering: no peace without Ukraine at the table. The world's conscience demanded it. International pressure forced a shift. The diplomatic winds changed, and the summit's agenda was rewritten in real time. Before Alaska, Trump conferred virtually with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, seeking common ground and building a united front. He ensured he carried both Ukraine's and Europe's concerns into the talks, determined not to repeat the mistakes of past negotiations. The world watched, desperate for a breakthrough. In living rooms and public squares, hope mingled with anxiety. Would Trump's direct, unpredictable style succeed where others had failed? Could his boldness break the deadlock? Or would Putin's resolve, honed by years of confrontation, hold firm against mounting pressure? The Alaska summit was a diplomatic gamble, with every move scrutinized by experts, critics, and ordinary citizens alike. The war's toll was immense: millions displaced, economies rattled, alliances tested, and the scars of conflict etched deep into the land and its people. The summit's outcome could reshape the geopolitical map, altering alliances and the balance of power for years to come. As the leaders sat down, the air was thick with uncertainty. Every breath, every pause, seemed to carry the weight of history. The initial diplomatic maneuvering revealed just how complex the path to peace would be. Centuries of mistrust and months of bloodshed could not be erased in a single meeting. Every statement, every gesture was analyzed for signs of hope or impending failure. The smallest detail could tip the balance. The world's eyes were fixed on Alaska, waiting for a sign that peace was possible, that compromise could triumph over conflict. The stakes could not have been higher. The fate of nations and the lives of millions hung in the balance. Would this be the moment the tide turned? Could hope finally overcome fear and suspicion? Or would it become just another chapter in a long, unresolved conflict, a fleeting chance at peace, lost to the shadows of history? Vladimir Putin wasted no time making his position clear. From the very outset, he set the tone for what would become a tense and high-stakes standoff with the West and Ukraine. His demands were stark and uncompromising. Ukraine must surrender the entire eastern Donbas region, including Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. These territories, already scarred by years of conflict, were now at the center of a geopolitical tug-of-war. For Ukraine, this was an impossible price to pay. It would mean the dismemberment of their nation, the loss of millions of citizens, and the erasure of centuries-old communities. The emotional and political cost was unimaginable for the Ukrainian people. Putin's second demand was equally severe. Ukraine must abandon its NATO ambitions and adopt permanent neutrality. This would effectively create a buffer zone for Russia, insulating it from what Putin sees as Western encroachment. No Western troops ever on Ukrainian soil. This was Putin's third, uncompromising condition. He insisted that any foreign military presence would be a direct threat to Russian security. These demands weren't new, but their timing was a clear signal: Russia would not bend. For Putin, this was the price of peace, not a starting point for negotiation. He presented them as ultimatums, not invitations for dialogue. The West now faced a profound dilemma: engage and risk legitimizing these terms, or reject them outright and risk prolonging the war. The hardline stance left little room for compromise, and the stakes could not have been higher. While Trump and Europe pushed for dialogue, hoping to find a diplomatic off-ramp, Putin's vision was clear: a non-negotiable security sphere dominated by Russian interests. The world saw the challenge. Could diplomacy overcome such rigid demands? The path forward was fraught with peril, uncertainty, and the risk of escalation. The stakes for Ukraine and for the global order had never been clearer or more urgent. The Alaska summit was tense, the air thick with anticipation and uncertainty as world leaders gathered around the table. Every gesture, every word seemed to carry extra weight, as if the fate of nations hung in the balance. President Trump didn't mince words. He was direct, forceful, and made it clear that the United States would not be sidelined or ignored in these high-stakes negotiations. He publicly warned Putin, if Russia didn't move toward a fair resolution, things would happen. The world's media captured every moment, amplifying the tension and uncertainty. This was no empty threat, it was a direct challenge, signaling U.S. readiness to escalate if needed. Behind closed doors, Trump's advisors weighed options, knowing the consequences could be far-reaching. Meanwhile, Putin, fresh from a military parade in Beijing with Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un, projected strength and optimism. He stood tall on the world stage, but behind the confident exterior, he doubled down on his demands, refusing to show any sign of weakness. The world saw mixed signals. There was hope for peace, but no real movement. While diplomats spoke of progress, military buildups and strategic maneuvers continued in the background, casting a shadow over the negotiations. Trump's warning was meant to cut through the ambiguity. Diplomacy had limits, and U.S. patience was running thin. He wanted to make it clear that the time for vague promises was over. The message was unmistakable. The U.S. was not just a mediator, but a major player with its own red lines. The tension in the room was palpable, as both sides measured each other's resolve. The diplomatic track was now a tightrope walk. One misstep could trigger escalation. Every handshake, every glance was scrutinized for hidden meaning. Trump kept the door open for more talks, signaling a willingness to negotiate. But the threat of consequences loomed over every conversation, a constant reminder of what was at stake. The world watched as the two leaders tested each other's resolve, their every move broadcast and analyzed by millions. Allies and adversaries alike waited to see who would blink first. Would pressure force a breakthrough or push both sides further apart? The uncertainty was almost unbearable as diplomats tried to bridge the widening gap. The stakes were global and the clock was ticking. Every hour without progress increased the risk of miscalculation, and the world held its breath. The hope for peace was real, but so was the risk of renewed conflict. The world yearned for a breakthrough, but the specter of confrontation lingered in every room. The next move could change everything. In this high-stakes game, every decision mattered, and the world waited to see who would make the decisive play. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz stepped up as a key strategist. He proposed sweeping new sanctions targeting Russia's energy sector and financial institutions, aiming to make the war too costly for the Kremlin to continue. The boldest idea, a reconstruction levy on any remaining trade with Russia, funding Ukraine's post-war recovery. This was more than punishment. It was leverage, linking economic pain to the promise of rebuilding. Merz's plan shifted the conversation, giving the West a powerful new tool beyond military aid and diplomatic warnings. Europe, under German leadership, signaled it was willing to bear economic pain to defend Ukraine's sovereignty. The threat of these sanctions forced Moscow to reconsider the long-term costs of its aggression. Merz wasn't just facilitating talks, he was changing the game. The West now had options, and Russia felt the pressure. The sanctions plan was a bold move to force a path toward peace. Germany's leadership was reshaping the diplomatic landscape. The stakes for Ukraine and for Europe had never been higher. Across Europe, unity was the watchword. 30 world leaders gathered in Paris to discuss long-term security guarantees for Ukraine. They knew a ceasefire wasn't enough. Ukraine needed real protection from future aggression. The Paris summit laid the groundwork for a robust security framework, even if no treaty was signed. Germany played a pivotal role, ensuring Ukraine's voice was heard and diplomatic channels stayed open. The EU prepared new sanctions, ready to act if Russia refused to change course. Nordic and Baltic nations ramped up military aid, showing solidarity where the threat felt most real. Europe's message was clear: peace could not be dictated to Ukraine. Its sovereignty and right to choose its destiny were non-negotiable. The continent's dual-track approach, diplomatic support and economic pressure, sent a powerful signal. Europe stood united, determined to defend Ukraine's freedom. The world saw a continent ready to act, not just talk. The stakes for Ukraine's future had never been more urgent. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stood firm. He rejected Russia's demands to cede territory and abandon NATO ambitions, calling them an invitation to legitimize aggression. For Ukraine, joining NATO was about security, not provocation. Zelensky insisted peace could not come at the cost of sovereignty or future safety. Instead, he pushed for binding security guarantees from allies, making clear that a temporary pause was not enough. His administration worked closely with the US and Europe, balancing battlefield defense with diplomatic outreach. Ukraine was no pawn, it was shaping its own destiny. Zelensky's red lines were clear, and his resolve inspired allies. The quest for a just peace became Ukraine's central diplomatic mission. The world saw a nation unwilling to be carved up for the sake of expediency. As talks with the West continued, Putin sent a message from Beijing. Standing with Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un, he showcased a growing alliance challenging Western dominance. This was more than symbolism. It was a strategic signal that Russia was not isolated. China and Russia's deepening ties gave Moscow economic lifelines and diplomatic leverage. North Korea's presence added a nuclear edge to the bloc. This Eastern alliance complicated the path to peace. Putin's confidence grew, believing he had powerful partners behind him. The Ukraine conflict was now a flashpoint in a larger global rivalry. The world saw the stakes, not just regional, but a contest between competing world orders. The balance of power was shifting, and the outcome in Ukraine would echo far beyond its borders. The US, under Trump, walked a fine line between diplomacy and deterrence. Trump's Alaska summit was bold, betting on personal diplomacy to break the deadlock. Behind the scenes, Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio coordinated with allies in Ukraine. The US strategy: build consensus, push for a ceasefire, and keep pressure on Moscow. Trump's warning to Putin, things would happen, underscored the hard edge of US policy. The approach offered incentives for peace but threatened real consequences for continued conflict. The goal was a settlement that respected Ukraine's sovereignty and security. Success depended on whether this mix of engagement and pressure could shift Moscow's calculus. The US led the charge, but the outcome was far from certain. The world watched as diplomacy and deterrence danced on a knife's edge. As the summits ended, uncertainty remained. Russia and Ukraine's positions were still worlds apart. Land for peace was a non-starter for Kyiv. Trump's high-stakes diplomacy brought new energy, but also new risks. Europe, led by Merz, worked to keep the West united and focused on Ukraine's long-term security. The question: could anyone truly compromise? The window for peace was open but fragile. One misstep could slam it shut. The world watched, anxious and hopeful. The fate of millions hung in the balance. Would this be the breakthrough or just another missed chance? Only time would tell if the fog of war would finally lift.